So to kick things off, let's go ahead back up to our texture set settings, and I'll just scroll down here. And we'll see under the channels section, these are all the different texture channels we're going to be working with. So we're going to be working with color, height, roughness, metallic, normal. You might be familiar with all of those, or maybe just a couple of them. But essentially all of these different texture channels are what combine to make our final material. We'll be using these texture maps that we generate here later on in Blender and Unreal to actually display the material we're going to create in Substance Painter. Now there is one more channel that I would like to add to this. So if we come up to the little plus option and click on that, we're going to add the ambient occlusion channel. And that's going to add just that channel down there. So now we can start affecting the just like contact shadow information in our model here, like up in this grooves of the tread and everything, just areas where there's going to be smaller shadow information. So let's come back to layers, and in our layers panel, let's go and add 3 folders. So I'm going to click this thrice or 3 times, and starting from the top, I'm going to double click and name this air cap. I'll name the second one hub, and the bottom one tread. And this is actually the reverse order we're going to be working in. We're going to be working on our tread first and going upwards. And just like in Blender with the collections, we could go and color them for a little bit of extra organization. We can also do that here in Substance Painter. So if I right click on this folder and I'll come down to these little color blocks, I can go and start giving them some colors. So I'll give each one of these just a different color, so it's easy for us to see what's actually going on just at a glance. And now that we've got that set up, we can go ahead and get started. So let's kick things off with our tread material. So to start off with most texturing that I do, I'll add just a very simple fill layer, which is this little paint can up here. So we'll just drag and drop that into our tread. And what the fill layer does is it essentially is like the fill tool in Photoshop, where it will just pretty much fill the bounds with whatever user data we want. So nothing's really changed right now, but we do have a bunch of options in our properties panel here. So you'll see this little material area and a bunch of these channels here. These are all the channels that we are going to be painting across when working in this project. And that's what we just had looked at just a little while ago. Now, depending on what you want to paint in, you actually can determine whether or not this layer affects these channels or not. Like we can see here that I can change the roughness of it. And if I hold down shift and just move our light around, shift and right click, you can see that I can change the roughness of this. And if I deselect this, it's no longer going to be affecting that particular texture channel. And actually, I don't even have access to playing around with the roughness for this layer. So that allows us to really specify what each one of these layers that we're going to create does, so that we don't overcomplicate things. And that's generally how I like to work in most instances, is using just very, single layers for very specific things. But like I was saying, I do generally start out with a base layer, which just kind of covers all of the texture channels we want to operate on, so that as we're building up these layers, there is a default information that we can start operating on. So I'm going to start with our base color, and this is where we can, play around with the color of the tread. Now I do have a color on my second monitor, which I'm just going to click and drag the eyedropper to select, so that it's going to give us this kind of blackish color. You can pause the video and do the same thing for the color here if you want to follow along. And my recommendation would be to not make this value anything darker than kind of like 0.02. You might be tempted to go and just make this black because rubber's black, but just for a whole laundry list of reasons with how PBR rendering and shading works, in the PBR value range, the albedo colors, of course, if I Control Z, it removes everything. Let me just grab this again. The PBR value range generally does not operate with pure black or pure white values. So I generally try to keep my value level around 0.02 if I'm looking for something pretty dark. Now I'm going to skip over the height because right now we don't have any variation in the height. So no matter what we set this to, it's really not going to show any visible difference. But I am going to leave this checked on just because as we're building up our different layers, I'm going to want to have this default height value on our actual texture set. And that'll make sense a little bit later as we get going. I'm going to also bring our roughness down. So this is, how rough this layer is going to be. So I'm probably going to have something around 0.25. So it's a little bit glossier, but it's not, pure just mirror reflection mode. And then again, for the metallic, normal, and ambient occlusion, I'm just going to leave them at their defaults, but I want to make sure that we're also still enabling them in the material channels because I want to give a base layer for our materials as we're going along. So that's a cool start, but again, this base layer is being laid over everything, right? Our hub, our air cap, everything is getting this base layer, and we don't want that. So this is where we're going to introduce the idea of masks, and masks are going to allow us to isolate specific regions of our model that we want certain layers to affect. And this is the reason I went and created these folders. So I generally break up my models into the very specific areas, or maybe there's specific types of materials. It's going to vary depending on how you want to do it, and each way has its own pros or cons. But I'm going to be treating this tread kind of as its own material separate from the rest of it, right? We're not going to be reusing this rubber on the hub or the air cap here. So I'm going to put my mask actually on the collection instead of just this individual layer so that everything within this collection or this folder is going to be masked off to the rubber. And we don't have to continuously create new masks for every layer that we're going to create because we're going to be creating a lot. So if I right click on the folder and I hit black mask, now we'll see that all of that's going to go away because I've created a black mask. And in terms of masks, you're probably familiar with the idea, but white areas are areas that we want to show through, and black areas are areas that are just going to be completely hidden on our mask. So with my black mask selected here, you can see it's right beside the color slot of this folder. It's this little black one here. We're going to come over to this little selection tool, which is our polygon fill. And we'll see that we're going to get our wireframe for our model. So what this tool does is it allows us to select different areas which we can then start to mask off. So I want to make sure that this color is white, right? We want to start masking off white areas or areas that are going to show through. And we have a couple of different selection tools. So I can go and select individual triangles. You can start to select full polygons, which I guess it just seems to triangulate it anyways. So we're not going to worry about that one. We can select an entire mesh. So if I went ahead and just selected this rubber because it's one continuous mesh, it's going to select everything and put it in our mask. And I'll just Control Z that. Because our final option, which is also very useful, is the UV chunk fill. So if I just quickly swap over to our 2D, UV unwrap here by hitting the F4 hotkey, you'll see that I can start selecting individual UV islands. And I'll just hit F4 to swap back. And we can also do this in 3D view. And it's going to fill just the individual islands. So remember, we unwrap this with a seam down the center here. Right? So we can start to fill islands that way if our mesh is maybe broken up into different materials. So I'll just Control Z all of that, and I'll make sure that we're just selecting our rubber. That's looking good. And then I can click back on the color slot here for our material. So that's going to be our tread masked off. And we're going to be exercising masks pretty liberally throughout this course because they are very, very useful for isolating specific areas. So that's been enough of me talking your ear off. Let's actually start to create some interesting data. So the next layer I want to create, I'll add a new fill layer, is going to be for the just kind of like the irregular rubber surface. We're going to have some kind of like imperfections in it. So I'm going to call this rubber surface. And I'm going to right click and add a black mask again. Now, before we get to doing any of the mask stuff, let's go and just uncheck all of these channels except for our height. So this is where I'm going to use our height here to now start creating some imperfections in the normal data of our tire. Now I know it's confusing because we just unchecked the normal channel and we're using height, but the way that Substance Painter works, if we take a look at our individual channels, is that it combines actually the normal and the height together and then converts it all into a normal map at the end of the day. So generally I work with height information, which is then converted into normals. So just before we get kind of confused and go, well, if we're working with normals, how are we working with the height channel? And I'm going to come over now to that height slider and actually increase that by 0.06, something really, really small. And again, we're not going to see it because we haven't added any variation to our mask here. So if we click back on the mask, and I'm just going to click on the paintbrush to get rid of those wireframes, and I right click on the mask itself, this is going to give me some options down at the bottom of ways we can generate some interesting variation into the mask. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select fill, and the grayscale here, we're going to select that. And now we're going to have access to a bunch of just procedural grayscale information, as well as, hard surface normals and stuff. But for here, we want to use a grayscale image. And so I'm going to type fractal into our search bar because I want to use the fractal sum base. And that is base colored. I think it's this one here, if my mouse can hover over it. There we go. So now we can see that that's added some kind of, interesting height or normal information. So quickly just go and look at the height. And actually the height, it's so, such like low contrast. You can't actually even see it in the height. But if we come to the normal, you can kind of see a little bit of that variation. So this is height information that's being converted into a normal map at the end of the day. So that's looking cool, but that's not exactly the look that I want. It's a little too noisy. So let's come into that grayscale fractal sum that we added and start playing around with its parameters. Let's bring up our contrast here, and this is going to operate on that texture. And we can see if we really crank up the contrast, that's really going to make things look pretty identifiable or like easy to see. So I'm going to set this to maybe like 0.2, and then I'm also going to select these noise parameters down here, which are going to be unique to the fractal sum. And if we just crank up the global opacity, we can see that we're going to get some of those irregularities. So it's going to smooth some of the areas out, but it's also going to give us some of those, kind of like caved in areas. And we can even play around with the min or max level. And actually I might bring the max level up something like 6. That way we're not getting these big swaths of it, but we're still getting, kind of these little areas. And what does this look like? And you can see you can get lost for hours doing this. And this is why texturing is a lot of fun. Now, what we might notice here is, and actually it might be a little too tough to see, is we're getting a little bit of a seam issue, right? And this is where we went ahead and seamed our tire. And because we're using a UV projection, what's going on here, if I go and swap back to our 2D view, is it's taking this procedural texture and mapping it over top of our UVs. So where the seams are going to be cut off and where the seams end up meeting each other on our mesh, there's going to be this very harsh line here. So a way that we can ultimately get over or around this in Substance Painter is up in this UV area that I kind of skipped earlier. So right now we can see that the UV projection is the projection type, right? And that's how I just described, it's projecting over top of our UVs. If we go and select this, we can do a triplanar projection, which is going to basically project that texture on top of our mesh in 3 directions, right? The X, Y, and Z, which is going to now alleviate those seam issues because we're getting just a full-on projection on top of our model. Sweet, so that's looking pretty cool right now for some of the irregularities in the tire. But now I want to actually vary up the roughness of it because it's still a pretty consistent, glossy, smooth material. So let's go and add a new fill layer, and I'll call this one roughness. And again, this is only going to operate on our roughness channels, so I'll just deselect all of those. And I'm going to take this roughness slider and bring this up to like 0.75. That's going to be pretty rough. And again, because we don't have any variation over how it's being displayed, it's just blanketly throwing this value over top of the entire model, it's going to look pretty bad. So let's create a new mask for our roughness, a new black mask. And I'm going to do another fill for this mask here. So if we come down, right click and add fill, and clicking on our grayscale, this time instead of a fractal, I'm going to look for grunge leak. And actually, if I keep typing here, grunge leak dirty. And I believe it's this one here that I really liked in my testing. There we go. So you can see now we're actually just getting some variation in the roughness for this guy, which is starting to add some visual intrigue to the surface of it. So we can play with the balance of this, having, more areas that are a lot more rough. We can play around with the contrast like we were doing with the previous layer. If we come up to the UV transformations, we can even change the scale if we want to start scaling it up. Now you want to be careful with this because we're going to get lots of repetitions, but this might help sometimes if you feel like the detail is a little bit too large. We can also rotate it and we can offset the UVs. Now again, you're going to notice that we're getting this pretty harsh seam transition. And for something like a roughness layer, it's going to be a pretty easy fix like our last one was. So let's go back up to triplanar. And again, it's going to cast that in 3 directions along our model here. And we can even maybe crank this up to something like 2. I want to see if I bring the balance up. Maybe bring this up to something like 0.7. And I might now go back to the fill layer. So clicking on this actual, fill spot for the channels of our layer. Maybe bring the roughness down to something like 0.65. I feel like 0.75 is a little too much. And this is just going to start adding some of that roughness detail. And we can take a look at our channel as well. If I click on roughness, this is what we're doing kind of under the hood, right, with this roughness channel here. Now, the next thing I want to take a look at is going to be a little bit more manual work. And generally, when you're working with building these textures, we want to kind of balance between the procedural and the manual aspect of it. You can oftentimes, by using these procedural generators, make something that does look a little too procedural. And you start to recognize some of the noises and the patterns and stuff. So you want to make sure you break it up by adding some custom, manual input into your texturing as well. So let's create a new fill layer, and I'm going to call this one text. So we're going to add just kind of like a nice text that's running along the kind of the direction or the flow of the inside of the tread. And this is where our UV layout is really going to do a lot of the work for us. So it's probably a good thing we unwrapped it the way we did. So let's right click and add a black mask. And on this black mask, I'm going to right click, and instead of adding a fill this time, I want to add a paint. So a paint is really just a paint layer, just like if I was to come up here and just click on this, I can start, clicking and painting on this model here, and it's going to just paint on this layer. Now, the reason I like to use a fill layer for this instead of using a paint layer is that I can go in and paint my mask and then start to play around with all of these parameters, like changing the color or the height or, roughness, or so on and so forth. Whereas if you go and do a paint layer, and actually I'll just kind of demonstrate this again, you can see that I can paint this, but if I come and change the color now to something like red, it doesn't change the strokes I've already done. I have to come in and paint again. So it's not destructive, but it definitely is not art directionable in the sense that we have to come in and repeat processes. We can't just go and change colors and all that. So coming back to our text, clicking on our mask, and then clicking on the paint layer, I'm going to hit F1 on my keyboard here to bring up this split view. And let's just go and quickly find an area on the tire model. So say right up here. So I can see where that is on my UVs. So I'll come down here and hit Control Z. So how I want to do this is I want to be able to use the UV layout that we have here in our favor to create text that follows the stretch of the tire. And because how we've gone ahead and done this, if I just go and create a straight line here, we can see the UVs are going to have this do exactly what we want. So the way that we can create some text in Substance Painter here is if I come over to, I believe it's in alphas. You can see that we've got some numbers here. I believe those are custom. And we go all the way down to, I believe it is font. Yeah, there we go. So you see in Substance Designer, we do have a couple of these different fonts here. And these are going to allow us to add some text. So I'm going to do the font, what is this? Black Ops 1. So I'll click on that and I'll scroll up here. So we can see that in our brush settings over in the properties paint panel here, under the alpha, because I've gone ahead and clicked on that, we have this Black Ops. And if I go and click on all of these, it's going to add that different alpha, but we're going to stick with this one. And we're going to have this text parameter here. So if I go and do something like chunks tires, right? Say I own a tire shop now. This is going to update in our brush. Now you're not going to be able to see it right away, but if I hold Control and then right click and drag out, we're still not going to be able to see it. What's going on here? Well, I'm not exactly sure why we can't see that, but normally we'll be able to see an outline of the text in our cursor here. So if I go and just click to stamp this down, you can see a couple things, right? It's cutting off the text, which is not great, and I really wish it was showing up. Not exactly sure why it's not. But you'll see that it's also kind of doing this weird bending thing. And if we take a look in our 3D view, it's just going straight across the tire here. So let's fix one thing at a time. I'm going to just decrease the size of the text to maybe something like 0.1. And if I click this again, now we can see that it's getting the whole text, but it's still doing that weird kind of like bending thing. So in our brush settings, you'll see if you come under this alignment section, we have this tangent wrap. So what it's trying to do is it's bending how it's stamping down the texture in our UV space to try and make the projection straight on the actual model. So you can see that this would, it displays in a straight line correctly as if we were stamping this down in our 3D view here. But we want to actually conform to the bend of the tire. So how we can do that is by changing this alignment from tangent wrap to UV. So now if I go and select this and click on it, you'll see it's straight in our UV and it's going to conform to the bend there of the tire. So now we can increase the size. And again, to do that, I'm just going ahead and control right clicking and then moving my mouse out. And I'm just slowly kind of increasing that there. So that's looking pretty cool. So I'm going to hit F2 on my keyboard to go back to my 3D view. And now the reason that I like to use the fill layer, like I was mentioning, is that now I have that positioned how I like it. I can go into our properties here for properties for the fill, and I can start playing around with how I wanted to affect our channels. So I can change the color if I wanted to. However, I'm going to leave that as just the white. Actually, again, following my own rules here, I'm going to try and do like 0.9, something that's just a little bit off white there. We can also play around with the height, which is again going to convert into normals. So if I decrease that, it's going to try and kind of like push it into the tire, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but you can do that if you want. I'm going to bring that up to something like 0.01. Actually, you can't even really see that. Maybe bring that up a little bit more. So I'll do something like 0.05. So we're getting a little bit of those kind of like raised, text, which is kind of cool. We can also make it a little bit rougher than the rest of the tire. And I'm gonna just disable the metal, normal, and AO channels. We don't really need to do that for this particular layer. And actually, maybe I should bring this down a bit to something like 0.5 on the roughness, because it's not going to be affecting those channels. Now, the last thing I want to do for this tread material is I want to just add a little bit more variation to some of the color, some of the roughness. We're going to be tackling a couple different channels with this last layer. So let's go and add a fill layer again. And I'm going to call this, we'll call it dirt, I guess. Whatever kind of gets the point across that it's going to be kind of dirty or grungy or dusty or whatever. Now, instead of using just this solid, color layer to add some of the variation, what I want to do is start to lean on some of the procedural materials that are here within Substance Painter to create some of that more visual intrigue. So if you come down to your shelf and click on materials, we're going to have access to a bunch of just default custom materials that we can use, which are pretty cool. And the one I want to use is this concrete dusty one. So with my dirt layer selected, if I just single click on this once, it's going to basically fill that into that layer we had selected. And now instead of the fill layer parameters, we're actually going to have the substance material parameters for this base material here. And this is going to be the kind of detail we're going to get from the base color, the roughness, the normal, or height or whatever. But again, we don't want to have a tire made exactly, entirely of concrete. So let's go and add a black mask onto this. And instead of using either a paint or a fill for our mask, what I want to do is also start using some of their smart masks. So if we click on Smart Mask down here, these are all different, generated masks that they've built and added to Substance Painter by default to get some very specific effects. Like you can see this one I have right now is Cavity Rust. You can see that we've got dust. We've got one that's, kind of like dirt around the edges. You can get a real, wide variety of looks just based off of using some of these smart masks and then the parameters that come with it. So I'm going to use the dust plastic one. I found that one looked kind of cool. And don't be afraid to, go outside of just what you think you would want to use, right? Like the idea of dust plastic doesn't really sound like it resonates with a tire, but I found that the patterns that it creates is actually really useful for this type of asset. So I'll click and drag that onto our mask here. And it might take a second to load, but there we go. We've got some of that concrete showing up on our model here. And I'm going to just Alt and left click on our mask to view it in our 3D view here, so we can see some of the areas that it'll be showing up on. And we can even play around with the mask editor that it has added to our mask here. So if you wanted to have a little bit more kind of grunge and dirtiness, maybe I'll do something like 0.65. You can play around with the contrast again. I think it's probably pretty good at default. And you can see kind of what's going on under the hood here is we're playing around with a lot of those mesh maps that we baked originally. So this one is really relying on the curvature map that we generated in the previous video. We can also scroll down to our image inputs here. And under the texture secondary, you'll see that it has this seed option. So one of the things that you'll notice as you're adding more and more of these smart masks is that when you add them, they're going to be in the same type of position and orientation across your object. So if I go and add a second dirt layer to this, and actually what I'll do is just Control D to duplicate, you can see that this all got a lot brighter because the mask is in the same exact spot. So this is the mask from the dirt copy 1. And this is the mask from just our regular dirt. So that's going to be a bit of an issue because, we want to change up some of the variety of where this is actually showing. So what we can do, if I come back to the mask editor, is click on this seed random. And when I click that, it's going to randomize the positioning and the rotation and some of the parameters of the base material or this grunge map that we're using for this mask. to give us some variety so that it's not just going to be the same every single time. So if you want to vary it up very quickly, playing around with the seed random is a great way to do that. So that's going to conclude this video. I think it's getting a little bit long on the tooth, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all of these features. So we'll take a look at finishing out the texturing in the next video for the hub and the air cap, and play around with some of the layers that we've created in this video to get something that, looks a little bit better than this. This is, definitely just tutorial mode. Now that you're a little bit more comfortable with adding layers and playing around with the different texture channels. So play around with that, and I'll see you in the next video.